When working with two activities, you can return data from the second activity by packaging the data as intent extras, just like you do when sending it in the first place. As with the data you're sending, you'll need a constant for each extra that's accessible to both the sender and the receiver that's used as the extra name and identifies that value. I'll demonstrate this in the project Return Data, and I'll start in the main activity. I'm going to declare two new constants here. The first will be a private constant, and it'll be an integer that I name detail_request. This constant will be used to coordinate the two activities. When I launch the detail activity, I'll pass in this request code, and when I return from the detail activity, I'll be able to see it again, and I'll know where I'm coming from. The value can be anything you want, but it just needs to be unique within this activity. Next, I'm going to set up a string constant that can be used as an extra name, and this has to be visible to both the main and the detail activities, so I'll make it public. And because this is an extra name, it'll be a string, and I'll name it return message. This can have any value you want. It's just a constant, and I'll just use the same string as the name itself. I'll go down to my onItemClickListener method for the list view. This method is being called when the user touches an item in the list. And I'm launching my activity with this code, the startActivity method. In order to coordinate the two activities with each other, I'm going to change this method call to something called startActivityForResult. And I'll pass in the intent object just like before, but I'll also pass in my new request code, detail_request. And that's the initial work I need to do on the main activity side. I'll be coming back here in a moment, but now I'll go to the detail activity class. The detail activity is using this layout, activity detail, and I'll control or command click to jump to that. I'm going to change the purpose of the floating action button in this activity. Instead of an email icon, I'm going to display a shopping cart icon. And when the user touches the button, that'll mean add this product to the shopping cart. And I'm going to use the same shopping cart icon that I created and used in a previous video. It's in my drawable folder, and it's named IC Action Cart. Now, the size of this graphic isn't exactly perfect. If I were getting this application ready for production, I would create another version of this icon that was 24 by 24 dps. But this is good enough for this demonstration. Next, I'll change the code in my detail activity class so that when the user touches the button, I'll send a message back from the detail activity to the main activity. That code is down here, where I'm handling the click event on the floating action button. I'll get rid of this code that's displaying a snack bar message, and I'll replace it like this. First, I'll create an instance of the intent class, and I'll name that new object data. And when I instantiate it, I won't pass any arguments into the constructor. That's because this intent object is only going to be used to package up some data. Next, I'll call data.putExtra, and I'll pass in that constant that I created in the main activity class, named returnMessage. That will identify the string that I'm passing back. Then I'll create my message. I'll start with the product object. Now, right now, the product object isn't visible to this inner class code, and I need to make a change up here to make it visible. I'll come back up to this declaration here, and I'll add final. By making this a final variable, it's now accessible to any code within an inner class, like this. And I can now say product.getName, and then I'll append a literal string of added to shopping cart. In a production application, I would actually save this data in a persistent data store, such as an SQL-like database. In this demonstration, I'm just sending the data back to the main activity. Now, I need to tell the main activity that everything was okay and the data can be processed. To do that, I'll call a method named setResult. And I'll use two arguments for this method, The first is a result code. I'm going to use a constant of the activity class called result OK. Notice there's also one called result canceled. And then I'll also pass in my data object. And finally, I'll call a method named finish, and that means close the current activity and return to the parent activity. So these are the 4 steps. Create the intent object, use it to package up your data, and you could put more than one extra in if you wanted, set a result and connect the data to the result, and then call finish to close the current activity and return to the parent. Now I'll go back to the parent activity, the main activity class. When you return to the main activity, you'll be calling a method named onActivityResult, and this is an override of a superclass method. So I'll type the beginning of the method name and then press Enter or Return to autocomplete it. I don't need to call the superclass's version of the method, so I'll delete that. Within this method, I first need to make sure that I'm coming from the expected detail activity and that everything is okay. So I'll use a little bit of conditional code for that. My outer if statement will check this condition. Request code equals detail request. The request code is being passed in as the first argument into this method, and I'm checking it against the constant I used when I requested the detail activity in the first place. I should receive it back again. Now, if that's true, I'll check one other condition. I'm also receiving the result code variable, and I'll check that against the constant result OK. So now if both of those conditions are true, I can process the data. Remember, I sent the data using the constant return message, so I'll use that constant again to extract the data. I'll create a string variable that I'll name message, and I'll get its value by calling data.getStringExtra, and then I'll pass in return message. Data is the third argument that's being passed into onActivityResult. This is how I receive the data from the detail activity. Now, I could use a simple toast message to display that message to the user, but instead I'm going to do something a little bit more interesting. I'll once again use a snackbar message. I'll call snackbar.make. The first argument is a view, and as I did previously, I'll use the coordinator layout variable. Next, I'll pass in the message that I want to display. And then finally, a duration, and I'll use a constant of snackbar.lengthlong. Now, if you like, you can add some functionality to the snackbar message. I'm going to call the method setAction. And this will display a link on the snackbar message that lets the user take an additional step. I'll display a string of go to cart, and then I'll pass in an instance of the onClick listener interface. And I'll create that here. And that generates the onClick method. And here I'll just use a simple toast message to tell the user that they would have gone to the cart if this application were finished. And then finally, I'll complete the snackbar code with .show right down here. So reviewing all this code, first I check to make sure that I'm coming back from the detail activity and that everything's okay. Then I extract my message string from the intent bundle. Then I create a snackbar message and display it, but also allow the user to jump to another action by adding an action to the snackbar message. And now I'm ready to run the code. I'll scroll down a bit to an item that has a fairly short name, polo shirt, and I see my floating action button with the shopping cart icon. And when I touch it, I come back to the main activity, and I see the message, polo shirt added to shopping cart. I'll scroll around a bit more, and I'll choose another item, this time the thermal vest, and this time I'll touch the Go to Cart message in the lower right corner, and I see the reaction, the toast message. From there, if you wanted to create yet another activity, you could create the shopping cart screen and add persistent data storage to your application and build an entire e-commerce app. So that's how you send messages back and forth between the main and the detail activities. Intents can be used to package the data going in both directions.